Hello and welcome back to our study through Acts. My name is John Nance and I'm one of the pastors at our Cedar Falls campus, and I am pumped to be with you for week 4 of our content. I've been on staff at Prairie Lake Church for 12 years. I actually helped launch our Grinnell campus back in 2012, and I worked there for 7 years before moving to join the staff at the Cedar Falls campus. I've worked with worship and production, discipleship in groups, and everything in between. And I love that I get to be part of a no matter church with campuses all across the state. When I moved to small town Iowa in 2012, it was quite an adjustment. You see, I had grown up and spent my entire life in the Chicago area. So moving to a town of less than 10,000 people was quite a culture shock. I went from the loud hustle and bustle of the city with traffic jams and lots of stoplights to wide open countryside with gravel roads and livestock. And I loved it. Moving to Iowa helped cement my love for the outdoors. Some of my favorite things to do now is camp with my family or jump into my kayak to go fishing. So what about you? Did you grow up in a bigger city or a small town? And what was your favorite outdoor activity or sport you were part of growing up? Get ready to pause the video, spend some time sharing together, and press play when you're ready to continue. Let's get into this week's content. We're continuing to work our way through the book of Acts in the New Testament. Now, Acts is literally one of my favorite books in the Bible, because it tells the history of how the church got started. The same church that we're part of today. Remember, the book of Acts serves as a unique bridge between the Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they document the life and ministry of Jesus, and the rest of the New Testament. After Acts, the majority of the New Testament is comprised of letters written by Paul to the early churches that were forming in cities and regions all around the world. Acts actually reads a lot like an adventure novel. As one scholar puts it, the book of Acts has everything but dinosaurs. It has earthquakes, shipwrecks, avenging angels, harrowing escapes, riots, murder, plots, political intrigue, and courtroom drama. It can be hard to keep up with the names, people, and places mentioned throughout Acts, but the writer of Acts was a disciple of Jesus and a doctor named Luke. He works hard to document the struggles the early church faced as it grappled with its identity and what it looked like for Jews, people who believed in God pre-Jesus, and Gentiles, people who didn't believe in God before Jesus, to follow this resurrected Jesus. Last week, we heard the story of Stephen, who is called the first martyr of the Christian faith. Stephen gives a heroic message, calling out the Pharisees and religious leaders for rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. And because of this, Stephen is put on trial and then sentenced to death and killed in public. This killing was approved and sanctioned by a Pharisee and Jewish leader we hear a lot about in Acts and the rest of the New Testament. It was a man named Saul. As we work our way through Acts 9, 10, 11, and 12, we'll read about Saul's conversion from really a Jewish extremist, a murderer of Christians, to a faithful follower and proclaimer of Jesus. We'll also hear about another apostle and early church leader, Peter, who was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and how he navigated the difficult and sometimes tense circumstances of an early church that was struggling to understand what it looked like for people of different faith, racial, ethnic, cultural, and socioeconomic backgrounds to all follow Jesus together. So, let's jump in. In the beginning of our reading this week, we learn of Saul's conversion. And this is a monumental event in Acts because it sets up the storyline for how much of the rest of the New Testament plays out. Saul was a Pharisee, an elite Jewish religious leader of the day. He had been trained since he was a young boy to be a rabbi, an expert teacher in Jewish law, who lived in strict adherence to the rules and customs of the Jewish people, including dietary laws, a dress code, certain people you could and could not interact with, and religious rituals that must be followed perfectly in order to attend the temple or synagogue where the Jews would gather on the Sabbath. In chapter 9, verse 1, we read that Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples, and was actually on his way to Damascus to round up those who belonged to the Way. These followers of the Way were Christians, and Saul was on his way to arrest and take them as prisoners, and if he felt it necessary, to take their lives. You see, for Saul, these Christians represented a threat to the way of life Saul and other Jews had devoted themselves to. Since the time of the Old Testament, God made a promise with his people, the Israelites or the Jews, that they would have a Messiah, a rescuer, a redeemer and savior of their people. Many Jews thought this Messiah would be a mighty warrior king who would overthrow all of Israel's enemies and oppressors. So when a man named Jesus showed up from Nazareth, what was considered a lowly, dirty city, who claimed to be this Messiah, many rejected him, especially when he began associating himself with the lowly, the outsiders, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, and the drunks. Saul and the Pharisees were among those who refused to believe Jesus was the promised Messiah because his teachings and approach didn't align with their expectations, and violently fought against anyone who followed Jesus or proclaimed Jesus' message of salvation for all people. They sought to silence the message of Jesus that was spreading like wildfire by any means necessary. But there's a plot twist. While Saul persecuted and ravaged the church through violent acts he believed honored the God of Israel, God was at work and ready to use Saul to preach the good news of Jesus. And on his way to literally kill and imprison Christians, Saul comes face to face with Jesus himself. In a flash of light, Saul is knocked to the ground and he hears a voice calling out his name. In your groups, let's read through this story, Acts 9, 1-7 together. Then you can interact with the questions that will be on screen. So get ready to pause your video, take a few minutes, and press play when you're ready to continue. Thanks for talking through those questions with your group together. You just read about Saul's conversion, literally the moment when Saul has a faith line experience. He realizes and believes that Jesus, in fact, is the Messiah, the Son of God. And it changes everything for Saul, including a name change. Fun fact, he becomes Paul, the guy who writes most of the New Testament later on. He begins living in a completely transformed way. Saul goes from persecutor to preacher. After he rests and recovers from his encounter with Jesus, he almost immediately goes back to Jerusalem and begins proclaiming the message of Jesus in the synagogues. And people are astounded at this change in Paul. While this is unfolding in Jerusalem, about 75 miles away in Caesarea, Luke, the writer of Acts, checks back in on Peter's story. Yes, this is the same Peter who was a disciple of Jesus, who rejected and betrayed him, and he's an important leader in the early church. Like Saul, Peter also was raised a devout Jew, observing all the Jewish laws and customs. And this is important to understand as we read about Peter's own experience in Acts chapter 10. In this passage, Peter actually has this wild dream, a vision that can be hard to make sense of when you read it in Acts. But it turns out to be a crucial message to Peter about how the church should operate, and that when it comes to faith and following Jesus, there's no insiders and no outsiders. Right now, I want to take a few minutes and read Acts chapter 10, verses 9-16 together. You can read out of your own Bibles, or we'll have the scripture on screen for you to follow. So let's read Acts 10, 9-16 now. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. Okay, what on earth was happening here? Is Peter just in a hungry delirium? Is he just hangry and hallucinating? Well, it's important to remember that Peter was a Jew. That meant that he obeyed the Jewish dietary laws and customs, meaning there were certain animals that were considered clean and approved to eat, and there were some animals considered unclean and were forbidden to eat, totally off limits. In Peter's vision, he sees these clean and unclean animals together. Animals that Jews and Gentiles would have kept strictly separated according to their own customs and laws. And Peter's actually commanded to eat them. When Peter pushes back, he's told that what was once considered unclean and off limits, God has now made clean and pure. This wasn't just a modification in religious tradition or practices. This would signal the beginning of a significant change and realignment of how Jews and later Jewish Christians would understand salvation. In the Old Testament, or with the Old Covenant, salvation was only found in strict obedience to the law. You couldn't be saved apart from the law, and the law was only available for God's chosen people, the Israelites. Now, the message from Jesus was that salvation was no longer found in the law, but by grace through faith, and it was available to anyone. So, in the early church, there was a lot of discussion and even deep disagreement on what following Jesus should look like. We see the apostles, Jesus' closest followers, discerning how the message of Jesus is transformational, both for Jews and for Gentiles. That salvation was available to everyone through Jesus raised a lot of questions. Did Christians need to obey and follow all the Jewish laws and customs? Did they need to be circumcised? Were the Jews still considered God's chosen people, his favorites? Could anyone really be part of God's family now? One New Testament scholar states that ethnic divides were deeply ingrained in the culture of first century Israel. Even Jewish Christians, such as Peter, thought of themselves as being among God's favorites. Luke, who was the Gentile writer of Acts, shows a careful progression of thought in the early church, where religious leaders like Saul and Peter started to break down their religious, cultural, and ethnic biases and began moving towards the truth that Jesus came for all people and that God shows no partiality. No more clean and unclean. No more laws and customs to stay pure. No insiders and outsiders. No more barriers that might keep people far from God. This vision that Peter has laid the spiritual groundwork for these thoughts and ideas that would begin to transform and define the way the early church would operate and the way the apostles would teach and preach about grace, faith in Jesus, and salvation. And these things are still part of our language in the church today. We're going to take a break for our last round of discussion questions. Get ready to pause the video, spend time sharing together, and press play when you're ready to continue. The stories of Saul and Peter give us a template and picture that still serve as an example today of how we as a church can be united through Christ in our calling to make disciples, even when we have deep personal differences. The early church formed amidst an enormous diversity of religious backgrounds, social status, economic power, age, and ethnicity. And despite all their differences, the message of Jesus and his transforming love persisted, and it grew because they were known and motivated by their love for one another, as informed by Jesus' love and sacrifice for them and for us. Christians were known not for the rules that they followed or the customs they adhered to, but by what they said and what they did. They preached about Jesus, and they acted like Jesus. And the message of Jesus and the way he lived was, and it still is, transformational. The church in Acts was countercultural. In a vicious and unforgiving first century world, they became known for their compassion, their selflessness, their commitment to meeting physical needs, of taking care of orphans and widows, and loving and caring for the lost and the forgotten. It didn't matter if you were a Jew or a Gentile, a man, a woman, a child, what your race, ethnicity, or religious background was. The message of Jesus was for you, because he actually gave his life as a ransom for you. As you leave group this week and jump back into your everyday world with your neighbors, your friends, family, your coworkers, your little Iowa, keep asking yourself, do people see the way I live and know I'm following Jesus? Am I living in a way that extends invitations or creates barriers? When I interact online, on social media, in meetings, or with my family, and the ways that I communicate and care for others, does it look like Jesus? Thank you for joining us for week 4 of our Acts series. We'll see you back again next week for week 5 and the story of the Jerusalem Council.